Welcome back, subscribers, and welcome new viewers. And I want to thank each and every one of you who have subscribed, who like and share my videos, because that helps my whole channel to circulate to more and more individuals just like you. And for those of you who would like to receive my very first newsletter, September newsletter, if you'd like to keep updated on my new book and my private readings and the list of them, then send me an email and I would be happy to send you my September newsletter. And my email address is thecreativewoman369@gmail.com. Okay, and today I'm going to read from Saturn book by Liz Green, and it's for all of you who have Saturn in the 9th house or Sagittarius. And I want to thank Tara for enabling me to make this video so that it can be put out for each and every one of you who also have this Saturn placement. All right. So, oh, and I also want to let you know that the reason why I do these and post these video readings from the different books, Pluto, Saturn, Chiron, the north and south nodes of the moon, and have available written copies is because that pertains and assists in two different areas of the frontal lobe, conscious part of our brains, that helps each and every one of us to go beyond these programs and these blockages even faster. Okay. Saturn in Sagittarius and the 9th house. The 9th house is considered to be the house of long journeys, both those made by the physical body and those which increase consciousness and broaden the perspective of the mind. In this basic interpretation, which is traditional, the duality of the Gemini-Sagittarius axis and the 3rd and 9th houses may be clearly seen. For 3rd house movement, related to Mercury, deals with the gathering of information, while 9th house movement, related to Jupiter, pertains to the discovery of meaning, which emerges when the information is finally put into perspective. These are, as has often been suggested, the two aspects of that perceptive function, which we term the mind. The 9th house is also the house of law by traditional definition, and just as there are two kinds of journeys, those of the body and those of the mind, there are also two kinds of laws. Man-made laws deal with the structuring of society so that it develops along the most positive lines and offers the maximum of protection to its members. Spiritual laws are not very well understood because they can only be apprehended by their reflection in human behavior. They might, in psychological terms, be called archetypes in the specific sense that Jung means this word. These laws are simply inherent in life rather than a product of life. In fact, they are perhaps, in a more esoteric sense, the reason for life. Unfortunately, all we know of these laws, apart from the discoveries of modern psychology, is that interpretation given by theology, which calls these archetypal patterns the will of God, and then attempts to interpret this will according to a particular dogma or ideology. The entire subject of law, whether it is the instinctual patterning of nature, the intellectual and moral structuring of man, or a less tangible and more ambiguous patterning of life in general, is at best an obtruse subject and not one to be defined in a few paragraphs. It is likely that there is no proper definition. The realm of the ninth house, however, is an obtruse and subtle realm because it is connected with the intuition and with the intuitive perception of the laws of living and being and consciousness. And an understanding of this house, which requires the exercise of the intuition, can provide the key not only to the overall patterns of humanity, but to the meaning behind a single life. Although a cadent house, and therefore considered by tradition to be weak, the cadent houses are the birthplaces of thought and the expression of a meaningful life as it is manifested through the midheaven and the 10th house as its seeds in the level of consciousness indicated by the 9th. This house is steeped in a symbolic perspective which suggests in an interesting manner the meaning of dualism as it is expressed by Sagittarius. From the perspective of the Sagittarian temperament, nothing is taken at face value, whether it is a person, a thing, or an experience. It is always a symbol for a broader, more basic experience or archetype, and this perpetual dual awareness of seeing the larger reflected in the smaller, of searching for cosmic meaning in the least of things, is a basic quality of Jupiter, of Sagittarius, and of the 9th house. Jupiter is a symbol for the intuition, as Jung describes this function of consciousness, the means of perception whereby the intrinsic meaning of a person, a thing, or an experience is seen instantaneously, without analysis, against the broad framework of the meaning of life as a whole. This is a more modern way of interpreting the ancient Hermetic axiom of as above, so below, an expression which is worn through misuse, but which still yields increasingly complex meanings with each successive look. Understandably, as the 9th house is connected with the intuition and the perception of meaning, the broad areas of religion and philosophy are usually associated with it, and on the individual birth chart, the 9th house will generally suggest the quality and amount of involvement which the individual is likely to have with what is loosely termed the path toward individuation or broader consciousness in a psychological sense, or toward initiation in an esoteric sense. It is probable that these two are connected in spite of the difference in terminology and viewpoint. And once again, the duality of the 9th house is evidenced for the two worlds of psychology and esotericism, ordinarily considered poles apart, are brought together under the umbrella of the search for meaning. Through the medium of this house and sign, Saturn tends to have a profound effect in coloring the individual's overall view of life and his capacity to find meaning in his own life. Whether we assign Saturn a psychological meaning and associate him with the shadow or trickster archetype of the unconscious, or whether we assign him an esoteric meaning and call him Lucifer, the behavioral patterns which seem to be concurrent with Saturn in the ninth house follow the usual path of constriction, overcompensation, disillusionment and pain, searching, and eventual inner realization and control. The kind of pain which usually accompanies this placement is loss of faith, and the search is generally for a new framework of spiritual and moral values by which the life may be given structure and meaning. The opportunity which Saturn offers here seems to be connected with a potential for direct intuitive perception of the wholeness and meaning of the psyche. And this perception often comes through what depth psychology now calls a peak experience. This kind of experience is the goal of the individuation process as Jung structured it, and is also the goal of many later developments in the field of depth psychology. It is also, under a different name, the goal of the discipline of certain schools of meditation and yoga. Whatever the experience is, and whether it comes in one brief and overwhelming flash, or is pieced together over a period of time by an increased flow of the intuitive function, Saturn in the ninth house is connected with the possibility of this kind of experience. This does not mean that this does not mean that only those individuals who have Saturn in Sagittarius or in the ninth house are likely to experience this influx of intuitive perception. However, it is possible that those individuals who have these placements or have Saturn and Jupiter in aspect find that it is more necessary for their psychological growth to pursue this kind of perception. It might be said that the psyche aims toward this more urgently because Saturn in the ninth house suggests that the more superficial values and theological offerings will not suffice. The man with Saturn in the ninth house is driven toward a direct experience of what we choose to call God. As usual, Saturn may disguise himself, and one of his favorite presentations when he is in the ninth house is the individual who believes in nothing. This kind of rather compulsive agnosticism or atheism is rarely the outgrowth of logical analysis, and a naturally pragmatic or earthy temperament, it is usually linked with fear and a rebellion against an inner urge toward things of a more abstract nature. Sometimes this kind of orientation is linked with an early upbringing of a dogmatic nature and a subsequent disillusionment. Saturn in the ninth house is often connected with a finely tuned sense of justice and a great sensitivity to the plight of humanity as a group, but there is often a tendency toward depression and lack of hope with this placement, particularly hope in the individual's own future. He may find it difficult to make contact with the flow of his overall self through the intuition, and is consequently left with a sense of futility, and often with a fear of the future. The man with a ninth house Saturn often finds through hard experience that faith is someone else's interpretation of life and of justice does not suffice. And it is often difficult for him to accept any authority, temporal or spiritual, other than himself, because he has been severely disillusioned by such authority in the past. This is the first stage of the process of disillusionment and rebuilding, connected with Saturn in the ninth house. If the individual persists in his growth, the development of his intuitive perception into the world of meaning guarantees him a much more direct and meaningful authority himself. There appears to be a definite link between Saturn in the ninth house and an early exposure to religious teachings of a dogmatic kind. Generally, this exposure ends in disillusionment later in life. The individual will often follow the characteristic pattern of attempting to crystallize values of an essentially inner and subjective nature into the formal ritual, structure, and uniformity of Orthodox religious ceremony. This becomes his spiritual security, and he relies on this structure for his sense of meaning rather than on any real perception of his own. The higher authority, whether a church or a father, offers a formula by which the rules given form the structure of life, and the individual is expected to cling, without question, to these rules rather than initiating an inner search whereby he can apprehend the laws of life by his own inner authority. Someone else's sincere but often narrow vision becomes his opinion, and he is trapped within the prison of his own narrow-mindedness. Generally, these opinions, in the end, fail him, for they do not stand up to his own life experiences. He is thrown back on his own resources and must begin again to build a different kind of framework for his beliefs. Saturn appears to have affinity with certain of our Western religions, or at least with particular aspects or interpretations of them, in particular Catholicism, Mormonism, and Judaism. It is not that these paths are to be criticized, for the outer form of religion is created by man in response to an inner need and perception, and any form created is necessary for a period of time. These paths become problems when they begin to crystallize, and this is often due to their interpretation by well-meaning but unimaginative individuals. What Saturn in the ninth house suggests is not that there is anything fundamentally wrong with one's religion, but rather that there is some degree of crystallization in the interpretation. The form has outlived its usefulness. Saturnian orientation in a religion inclines toward much emphasis on law, structure, guilt, punishment, and the unknowable will of God, with little emphasis on life, quality, inner meaning, or individual growth. It is often the parental interpretation which is the problem. A childhood steeped in the Saturnian kind of morality and belief can be a fruitful source of guilt. It can help to create in the individual a doubt in his own right to decide for himself the inner or spiritual meaning of his life. This is destructive because it stifles growth. This is often the goad which drives the person with a ninth house Saturn deep into the realm of philosophy or psychology, so that some kind of solution can be found for the riddle of one's existence. The prison of a ninth house Saturn is a subtle one, but it is built through loss of hope and faith and an inability to establish the meaningful subjective contact upon which real vision is built. By the denial of this basic need for hope, Saturn suggests the necessity of the individual's finding the needed experience firsthand, without the help of dogma, of groups, guides, or gurus. Nothing except direct experience will suffice. It is in this direction that the opportunity of a ninth house Saturn lies. The entire spectrum of Saturnian camouflage may be observed in Saturn in the ninth house, ranging from the complete skepticism of the rational thinker through the narrow vision of the fanatic to the disciplines and probings of the practical occultist, and finally to the muddled and well-meaning gullibility of the man who is willing to believe anything as long as it will give him back his faith. Behind all these costumes stands the inner urge toward a direct spiritual experience and a direct personal accusation of knowledge which will throw light on the more ambiguous areas of the human existence. This is quite a long way from conflict with the law. And yet, the phrase applies. It is perhaps descriptive of the man who is engaged in a struggle between his own inner convictions and the beliefs and formal trappings which have been handed to him by his environment. This kind of struggle between inner values and outer opinions always applies to Saturn's placement on the birth chart. And in this position, the struggle lies in the realm of the ideas which, when colored by emotional values, become translated into ideals. The Sagittarian temperament must have an ideal by which he can live. Without the dream or the vision at the end of the climb, he cannot find the necessary one-pointedness even to begin. The same situation is true of the person with an emphasized ninth house, and it is particularly true in a specific way of the person with Saturn in the ninth. He also must have an ideal by which to live, but he must also understand the idea behind it, which lies beyond the plane of emotional aspiration and is more purely a product of the intuition. Without this kind of direct understanding, he loses hope and plunges into the kind of depression which is so typical of this Saturnian placement. Or he may seek to escape by one of the various expressions of overcompensation. Saturn in the ninth house is often referred to as concurrent with a profound and penetrating mind. The more conscious individual will generally express his quality to a greater or lesser degree. He generally arrives at this point, however, by the long, circuitous route. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly. I apologize if I'm not. And it is only after he has experienced the opposites that he can be truly free of the crystallizing effect that Saturn has on the mind. He has the possibility of finding some very valuable answers to some very broad questions. But he must find them himself without help. Saturn will tolerate no one else's authority. The man with a ninth house Saturn usually finds that he has to be his own priest, pope, and savior because all moral and ethical values lie within him. It is the fine tightrope between the opposites which he generally is required to walk with an acute sensitivity to the fact that all moral and ethical values are, in the end, relative, and yet that the universe is intrinsically moral in an altogether different sense. While realizing that all ideals and concepts are relative because they are only a part of the whole, the responsibility still lies on his shoulders to act in a fashion which serves the growth of the whole. This is a tightrope in a very literal sense. On one side lies the gray, purposeless, which usually exists side by side with the with the relinquishment of one's dreams. On the other lies an incessant struggle with anything which symbolizes authority. At the end of the rope, successfully crossed, lies a kind of freedom which usually is experienced with the quality that the Sagittarian expresses most easily: joy. Wow. Okay. If any of you would like a written copy of this, please send me an email. I hope this was helpful. Until next time, bye.